We're going to get started. So I've been a part of many a Zoom like you guys, but I don't think I've ever been part of a Zoom with 40 people, and this is a big one. So we're excited to have you. I think we had about 60 sign up. I anticipate we'll probably have maybe even a few more join us. So I wanted to first of all thank Dr. Andy Danylchuk for willing to do this for us. And before we get into what you guys came to learn, there's a few things I want to share with you about private water fishing and some of the things that we're doing and some of the things that we've done. And primarily what it relates to is about lake management and what I call the 5 pillars of lake management. But before we do that, I want to just kind of go over a few of the rules. Since there's so many of us, we're probably going to leave everybody muted. So if you'll stay muted as possible, we'll have questions and answers at the end. If you want to chime in, if we can save it till the end. I think Andy wants to make it kind of interactive, but we'll see how it goes, how much interaction we have. So let me get into what I call the 5 pillars of lake management. So the first one is water quality. And all 5 of these we try to monitor as best we can at our lake. So what does water quality mean? Really for us, we're checking alkalinity, pH, and the fertility of water. So there are certain things that we do to change the water chemistry. So in several of our lakes, we actually apply water-soluble fertilizer, primarily a phosphorus fertilizer. And the reason we do that is to create plankton in the water. Without plankton, the invertebrates and the crustaceans, which feed the bluegill, which feed the bass, don't grow. So when you go to a lake and you see clear, beautiful clear water is not good. Clear water is sterile water, and sterile water does not grow bass. So what we're trying to achieve is water that's a deep green or a green brown water. And ideally we like that water to be 15 to 24 inches in clarity. So that's what you may have heard the term plankton bloom. That's what a plankton bloom looks like. It's either zooplankton, which is a brown green, or green, which is a phytoplankton or plant-based plankton. The second pillar would be habitat. I think most of you probably know what habitat, that's points, humps, brush piles, rocks, anything that you can put into the lake. So when we consult in building new lakes, we want to make it, I always say, we want to make it look like a bomb went off in the lake. So we don't want a lake that looks like a toilet bowl, which is a lot of how dirt contractors used to build lakes. They used to make them for cattle. They make them smooth like a toilet bowl. Well, when we're consulting for fishing lakes, we want the polar opposite. We want it to look like, the whole thing just blew up. Humps, rocks, points, et cetera, et cetera. The third would be forage. Most of you probably know the backbone of every one of our club lakes is bluegill. You call them sunfish, brim, perch, whatever you want to call them, but they're really in the bluegill family. They're in 100% of our lakes, and they are the backbone of all lakes in Texas and Oklahoma. We also, on occasion, will add tilapia, and we'll add threadfin shad and even crawfish to the lakes. The fourth is genetics. And in 1982, I believe, the state of Texas brought in Florida bass. And before we brought in Florida bass, a 5-pound bass was a giant. And I think the lake or the state record stayed at 10, 11, 12 pounds for forever. And then in 1982, we introduced Florida bass. And for those of you who don't know about Florida bass, they get a lot larger than our native bass that we had in our waters prior to 1982. So what's happened over the years is the native bass have now spawned with the Florida bass. And so we get a little bit of the best of both worlds. We get the size of the Florida bass and the aggressive nature of the native bass. And sometimes you'll hear that referred to as an F1 or an F cross. That's simply nothing more than a native bass mixing with a Florida bass. And then there's something called genetic outbreeding. Typically, the Florida genes get outbred. So when possible, we go back and we'll add Florida genetics back into our lakes. And we typically do that with fingerlings. We probably have 10 lakes we'll be doing that to this year. We'll be adding 500, 600, up to 1,000 small fingerlings. They come about 2 to 3 inches. Most of them will get eaten, but if we get 50 to make it, that's enough to change the genetic makeup of the lake. And then lastly, harvest. And you guys have been awesome about helping us harvest these lakes. And without you, harvest doesn't happen. And I will tell you candidly, there are some landowners, the main reason we're able to fish their lake is by getting buy-in from you guys to help us harvest bass. It's critical. In most lakes, we need to be harvesting 10 to 20 pounds per surface acre per year. If the lake has gotten out of bounds, that number jumps all the way up to 40 to 50 pounds per acre per year. So thank you for harvest. It's immensely important. It's also immensely important in helping us sign up new lakes. As you imagine, some of our landowners have, they've been blessed, financially blessed, and part of our sales pitch to them is our members will help harvest. So it's very, very important. So kind of to that end, it leads us to our presenter today. When we talk about harvest, we want to talk about how to handle fish, right? And growing a 10-pound bass is a freak of nature, and it doesn't happen by accident. And we want to make sure when we're handling those big 7, 8, 9, 10, 12-pound bass that we handle them gently and we handle them the way we should. So Riverhorse, who I'm going to introduce, is a member of Private Water Fishing, is friends with Dr. Danylchuk, and he reached out to me and said, I think there's a guy you want to get to know. And so I want to introduce who Riverhorse is. He's a Houston member. I'm going to read his bio for you. It was on your invitation. So he's the star of the 2019 film Love and Water, which I've seen. It's great. A documentary that followed him through his beloved Texas coast and Forest Lakes. He's also the star of 2021 Patagonia film, A Northern Light, which I watched as well. I believe he'll verify this. He is the only Texas Patagonia influencer, or I don't know the right terminology. He's a staff writer. Now this tells you Riverhorse's interest. He's a staff writer for numerous publications, including Surfing, Surfer, the Surfer's Journal, the Fretboard Journal, the Vintage Guitar Journal, the Fly Fish Journal, American Angler, and many others. I think you left off, wasn't a skateboarding in there? Or, oh, hang on, I'm going to unmute. There you go. Are you unmuted?
You betcha. No skateboarding here. Just
I thought it was skateboarding for some reason. So I'm going to ask Riverhorse to introduce our presenter and take it from here, Riverhorse.
Thank you. And actually, the real star of the show is one of my best friends and mentor, Dr. Danylchuk. And he has what I would consider one of the coolest titles in the world. He is called a professor of fish conservation. I mean, I'm just, when I'm not doing that other stuff, I'm a nerdy poetry teacher, but that's a cool title he's got. He's from up in Canada, but he's on the East Coast now. He's the director of the College Coastal and Marine Science Program, and also the Intercampus Marine Science Graduate Program at University of Massachusetts. He's a National Fellow of the Explorers Club, Bonefish and Tarpon Trust Research Fellow, and an ambassador for Patagonia, Thomas & Thomas, and Sightlines Provisions. And what Steve said is true. We're with Patagonia, and it's a great outdoor company. And that's how, he and I really started to have conversations, but I had known about him for years and just read all his work. And I love these darn fish, and I love catching them. And I just thought it was a perfect match. I said, let's get our club together and talk about how to treat these fish well. And it's just a win-win for, you know, the ranchers and all of us. And maybe after today, whatever you possibly learn on here, you could just tell other people or pass it down to kids and other people you fish with. So I love talking with Andy, and even the last time we met with Steve, I learned 3 or 4 new things that I just thought, well, how in the heck, you know, did I? So every time even I get to talk to him, I'm thrilled. So without further ado, the real star, according to me, is Dr. Danylchuk.
All right. Well, cool. Thank you very much. Thanks to Steve, and thanks Riverhorse for that introduction, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It's an honor to be here, and an honor to sort of share my passion and my interest, and hopefully learn a thing or two. And so I'm gonna try to share my screen here. My day job, I'm a professor, so I'm kind of used to this kind of thing. So you should all be able to see that screen, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, and just the screen and me?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay, good. Just double checking. All right. So, you know, in addition to being a professor at University of Massachusetts and at Amherst and all these other connections to the industry, I'm also the scientific advisor for a non-government organization called Keep Fish Wet. And it's really all about helping anglers improve the outcome for each fish they plan to release. And I'll talk a little bit about the sort of the nuts and bolts behind the best practices, and even sort of tie in some of the things that Steve mentioned about all these things that we try to do to keep our fisheries safe. But I just wanted to start the presentation by demonstrating that, oops, why did I not go ahead? There we go, hang on. Demonstrating that I do know something about bass. Now, these aren't Texas bass, of course, but this is back in my formative years. I grew up in Southern Ontario, and basically started fishing for largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, northern pike, not with a fly rod, but with a pitching stick, and, you know, lots of conventional tackle. And it really kind of set the stage for the rest of my career. No, I fell in love with fishing. I fell in love with snorkeling around and watching the fish and doing what they do. And it was something that really kept me alive, basically, and kept me going in terms of not only just my as a hobby, but also as a profession. And so when I was growing up around the Great Lakes, it was very obvious that, you know, our fish are sort of you know, threatened by so many different things, right? And this could be the coast of the Great Lakes. It could be, you know, inland Texas. It could be the coast of Texas. It could be anywhere. But there's all these things that our fisheries face. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we manage them in such a way so that they're around for future generations to enjoy. And I'm not going to go through all the different things on this list, but some things are a lot more tangible or tractable to the individual angler than other big things like climate changing or logs or dams. Yes, sure, those things are very important to think about, but we all can't like make a decision today to make a change and have that change have a positive impact on the future of that fish. It takes a larger collective effort. And so when it comes to thinking about all these things that affect fish, it even ties back into the pillars that Steve talked about in terms of water quality. If water quality is bad, that's going to affect fish. If habitat is bad, that's going to affect fish. If there's no forage base, no food, that's going to affect fish. Genetics and also harvest, right? So it's all about trying to develop sort of a balanced ecosystem in order to create the best fishery possible. And in this case, for recreational angling, right? And so, and this comes into this whole idea of like what we want to do, you know, so my day job, I'm a professor of fish conservation, and a goal of conservation is really to think about, you know, how do you create a resilient population? You make a population that's resilient to disturbance, whether it's fluctuations in water chemistry, fluctuations in water level, temperatures, harvest rates. You want them to be able to recover quickly after an impact. You don't want it to take years. You want it to them to be rebound. You want them to be able to adapt to change, because whether we like it or not, there might be some things that are outside of our control that we can't change. So we want to make populations that are relatively robust to that, so those pressures, and make a population that's available for future use, right? We want to make sure that it's sustainable, whatever we do in terms of conservation. And so this comes into, the things that that anglers can do, and this idea about best practices for catch and release. Catch and release is widely used as a conservation and management tool, right? And so it can be voluntary if you just manage, if you want to practice catch and release as a conservation ethos. You don't want to eat the fish, you want to put it back. Or people practice catch and release even if they're out to harvest, because if you're on a lake where there's a size limit, you're inevitably going to be putting some of the fish that you catch back. And it's those fish that you put back, catch and release is only effective if those fish survive and they swim away to live to be caught another day and be healthy and spawn and do everything that fish need to do. And in the last 30 years, there's actually been a science that's developed around catch and release and the different attributes of the angling event that can influence survival and the health of fish after they're caught, handled, and then put back. And it's only been within the last decade, though, that those numbers of studies have really accelerated, covering a wide range of species and across a lot of settings where we can start to look at common denominators, things that we know across all these species that really have a big importance, that play a big role in the future of those fish that you're planning to let go. And of course, here's our I had to pull this image of Riverhorse here off the internet, but and it's not just about largemouth bass. It could be about redfish. It could be about grayling in the Arctic. So a lot of these principles, I know everybody is excited about hearing about bass, but these principles also apply to going and fishing in other places, whether it's on the Texas coast or flying to the Bahamas for bonefish or Mexico or whatever. And so I hope what you learned today, you also can translate to other species that you like to target. And so, so what is Keep Fish Wet? I have to put this in, and what we do as an organization is we really help anglers improve the outcome for each fish they release, and we focus on what's in an angler's control, right? There's certain things that we do that we, the types of baits that we use, the types of gear, when we fish, how we fish, those are things that are in our control, and there's certain things that might not be. And those things that aren't in our control are probably better served in terms of lake management or thinking about bigger policy and other decisions that have to happen. And the reason why the organization is different than some other ones that might be trying to do this is that all of our best practice are science-based, meaning that they're not based on anecdotes, meaning that they're based on scientific methods that are repeated, that we use, powerful statistics. We have lots of the best catch and release scientists as part of our organization. So the connection between the science and the very boring scientific papers that the scientists produce, the distance is reduced because we translate the science, we make the best practices very tangible, very easy to understand, and we allow the anglers to put those best practices to use right away after they learn what they are. And some of them make very intuitive sense, but I hope I can also shed some light on some recent science that happened, especially related to black bass and other things. And so it's also important to understand what key fish is not. We're not opposed to harvest. Some people think, oh, you're just all about catch and release. It's not, no, we're not opposed to harvest because I like to eat fish. Other people like to eat fish. It's important for lake management. We're not just fly fishing only. So, just because Riverhorse and I, are with Patagonia fly fishing and we like to fly fish, I also conventional fish, and these practices really transcend angling types. We also don't say their fish should never be out of water, even so it says keep fish wet. I'll get to the science in a minute, in that the science shows something slightly different, and that kind of helps with the adoption of these best practices and how we need to take care of the fish that we're going to handle. We're also not necessarily about, in this day of social media, you know, sometimes there's a bit of a buffer between, you know, when you're chatting on the phone or commenting. We're also not about shaming or calling out fellow anglers. We're about a constructive educational process where hopefully, if after you, you know, we sit through the talk and we have a discussion and you're out on the water and you see somebody do something that doesn't necessarily abide by these best practices, you go and you talk to them about it. You know, you don't post it on social media and rip them apart because of it, because it's a process. And, you know, if you look back in the pictures from me when I was 14 years old, I was holding fish out of water and whatever. And it's an evolution. As it's a personal evolution and an evolution as we do more science, it continues to help to inform the best practices. So I hope that makes sense so far, and I hope I'm going at a good pace. So I'm going to transition to this example, and this is an extreme one, right? So here we have an example where we've got this angler that happened to be waiting in the Bahamas in a wonderful, you know, it's sunny, it's warm, and they've caught this bonefish, and they have to make a decision about what they're going to do when they handle this fish. And the desired outcome is A, right? That you release the fish, it swims away, it goes and it continues to eat, and it spawns, and it's happy, and it can be caught another day, and it contributes to the economy and everything else. Or the extreme is B, where, you know, the fish is so stressed that if there's sharks around, you know, the shark eats half of it, and the likelihood of that fish being caught again is 0. The likelihood of that fish spawning and contributing to the population is 0. And you might say that, oh, well, this only happens in the places where there are predators like sharks and barracuda. But we've done studies in freshwater systems with trout and bass to show that this can also happen with osprey. This can also happen with northern pike if you're in a situation with other predators. And it's also not just mortality. It's not just something that eats it, but depending on how that angler interfaces with that fish, you could stress it out to the point where it takes a while to recover from being angled. And so it doesn't go right back to eating right away. And it doesn't go right back to spawning. It doesn't go right back to doing its thing, because it needs to recover that energy that it just expelled by fighting on the end of the line. And so when we talk through these best practices, I want you to think about what's happening, whether it's a bonefish or a bass or whatever, redfish, you know, on the end of that line is actually exercising, right? And it's very similar to what's happening to us if we go for a run. If, you know, if Riverhorse goes for his daily run and, you know, he's exercising and he starts to get a cramp in his leg, right? And that's because of the buildup of blood lactate and your muscles getting fatigued. It's the same stuff that happens to fish. That's why we can reel them in, because their muscles get fatigued, they get tired, and you could reel it in. If they didn't do that, you could fight them forever, or they could fight you forever. So we have to think about it from the fish's perspective, that what we want to do after this exercise, you know, we're going to land that fish and we're going to handle it and do it in such a way where we want to minimize the additional stresses so that when we do let it go, it can recover as quickly as possible, get on to doing its thing, and contribute to the population and to be caught again, and everything in between. So this is where we also think about maybe not necessarily the lethal effects like in B, but even the sublethal effects. And this is where the science comes in, because as a nerdy scientist and other scientists that do this, what we end up doing is we either track the fish after they're released, we do some blood chemistry, we do a lot more than probably most anglers would, because after you release their fish, what do you want to do? You want to go catch your next fish, right? So you're not spending the time thinking about the details of what happens to that fish you let go. And this is where the science of catch and release comes in. All right, so we have 3 main guiding principles that are critically important to best practices for catch and release. The first one is to minimize air exposure. And basically across all the science, there's a ton of studies that and that have been done on largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, pike, you name it, and different water temperatures and all sorts of things, that the science shows that anything less than 10 seconds is okay. And that's 10 seconds in total. That doesn't mean you can take the fish out for 10 seconds, put it back in the water, and then take it out for another 10 seconds and put it back in the water. We'll get to that in a second, because that's all included in the handling. But all the science shows that 10 seconds is okay. And when you think about it, 10 seconds is a pretty long time. If you were to hold your breath for 10 seconds, okay, that was 10 seconds, right? And it doesn't seem like, if you're in the moment, sure, that seems like a very short period of time, but what it means is you need to be prepared, and we'll get to that in a second. But 10 seconds should be enough if you're holding it in the water and say you still want to have somebody take a photo, and we'll get to that in a second. You just sort of plan to make sure that 10 seconds is achieved by making sure you've got everything organized for that photo, or you're going to turn the hook and let the fish go if you're not going to take a picture of it, if it's not a trophy or not something you want to celebrate. And so, and this ties back into some of the challenges of having a presentation. I like to do this in person most of the time, and I usually have some props, but getting into how fish actually breathe, right? And you ask somebody like, so how do fish breathe? How do fish breathe? Riverhorse, I'll put you on the spot. How do fish breathe? Uh-oh, do I have to unmute you?
Yeah, through the gills, buddy.
Yeah, so how though? How do they get that dissolved oxygen? The water's not, when you look at the water, you don't see the oxygen, right?
Comes through the plates.
Yeah, it does. But there's a specific path that the water needs to take, right? So we have to remember that fish only get oxygen from the water, not air. Yes, there are some exceptions where there are some species that can gulp air and supplement that oxygen. But thankfully, I've got this, image of our black bass here. And so the water needs to go through the mouth and over the gills and out the gill plates, or operculum. And the reason why that direction is important is that when that water flows through the mouth and out the gills, the blood in the gills is flowing in the other direction. And what that does is it creates enough pressure so that the dissolved oxygen goes from the water to the blood. And so it doesn't work as efficiently if the water and the blood are flowing in the same direction. So the whole idea about moving a fish back and forth to recover it is not as productive as maybe moving it in a figure-8 pattern, because you want to make sure that water is going through the mouth, over the gills, and out the gill plate. And it also, when we think about the air exposure itself, the science is really focused on to what degree of air exposure is bad. And this is why we go to the 10 seconds or less. We've done enough science that shows that 30 seconds or 50 seconds or a minute is probably not the best, that 10 seconds is better, because we've seen what happens to the outcome of the fish, whether it doesn't go back to its nest, whether it doesn't swim in the same way or go back to feeding. And what happens, so these gill filaments are super fine and they're covered with mucus, just like the slime on the rest of the fish. They have slime or mucus on their gill filaments. And what happens is when you lift that fish out of the water, all the gill filaments collapse, because in the water they're suspended like the parts of a feather, right? That they're suspended by the water. And as soon as you take the fish out of the water, those filaments collapse. And when you put it back into the water, they don't come apart as fast as we would like, which means their ability to uptake oxygen is potentially reduced. And so this is why that 10-second rule is really important. 10 seconds or less is best. And there's still a lot that you can do in 10 seconds to get that photo or dehook the fish and get it on its way if you're not going to harvest it. And this becomes even more important, as, water temperatures increase, if dissolved oxygen in the lake is lower. We think that bass are incredibly hardy, and they across the board generally are, but they still can be influenced by being taken out of the water for too long. And ultimately, the longer it takes for them to recover from air exposure, the more time it takes them to go back and doing what they want to do, which is eat and grow into those trophy-sized bass that we all want to catch. So first principle is minimize air exposure, keep it 10 seconds or less. And so how do you do that is that you keep the fish in or over the water. So I poached some nice pictures from the internet. So in this particular case, this nice bass is still in the water. You can still get a great photo. Yes, your face is not in the image, but it's captured in the moment. If you are going to take the fish out of the water, a really good way to identify, to show that you follow those best practices, is that fish is dripping. So, it takes more. If it's not dripping, it's probably been out of the water for more than 10 seconds. And so that's another way to think about it. Another way in terms of thinking about that 10 seconds rule is that going back to holding your breath, right? If you've just had this great fight with a nice bass and you want to take it out of the water for a picture, hold your breath. And when you're out of breath, that fish is probably out of breath too, and it's probably time to go back. It also means that, trying to be prepared, keep the fish wet. I know some places you do or you don't use a net. If you need to use a selfie stick for a photo, or if you're fishing with somebody, work together to make sure that fish stays wet, so that even when it comes to taking a photo, you time it so that the person with the camera calls the shots. And I'll get into that in a second. And then lastly, I've asked this all the time, is what do you do when a fish is deeply hooked? Do I take it out of the water even longer and try to get the hook out? And I say this a couple of times, it's really important for a deeply hooked fish, just cut the line and let it go. There's ample science that shows that hook will pass. And if we go back to also, you probably can't see it in the other photo anyway, but that's too fast. But where the heart is, and I'll show you in another picture, the heart and a lot of really important internal organs are right down in the esophagus, just below the esophagus. So if you have a deeply hooked fish and you're trying to get that hook out, there's a potential that you might nick the heart. You might nick an artery that goes to the gills. And fish like black bass and other species, they eat hard, crunchy things. And over time, they will pass that hook. So for, the value, the amount of money that's invested in each one of these black bass, sacrifice the 20-cent plastic worm and the keeper hook, right? Or whatever you're using, like if that really allowed them to devour that hook and suck it down. So when in doubt, cut the line. The other thing, second principle is eliminate contact with dry surfaces. And so fish need their slime for two main things: hydrodynamics. It makes them slide through the water, so it improves their swimming performance, and for protection. It's like that extra layer of protection to their skin that prevents disease and infection and parasites. And so whatever you do is you don't let your fish come in contact with anything that can remove the slime or scales, including dry, rough, or hard surfaces. This, when it comes to landing a fish and holding a fish, always wet your hands. If you've got dry hands and say you just put on bug spray because the mosquitoes are bad, or you put on sun lotion, all that stuff is not good for the fish, and it can remove slime. I know this isn't a black bass or a largemouth, but this is an image from a study that we did on northern pike that showed that, and you can see that we used, there were some colleagues actually that used forensic techniques to look at where the slime loss occurred on fish. This is a northern pike. And this pike was put on the carpet of a boat on the inside. And you can see where all that slime, where it was fluorescing, that's where the slime was lost. And where I want your mind to go is like, okay, if the slime was lost, then the fish is going to need to take energy to replace that slime. And where is it going to take that energy, get that energy from? It's going to take that energy from its body. And instead of putting that energy to growth or feeding or anything else, it's going to have to repair that energy deficit to heal from this experience. So how do you then think about eliminating contact with dry surface, right? You certainly don't do this. You know, I've seen lots of examples. Again, I poached the internet. Apologize if these are any of your photos. But, you know, laying them on the grass, putting them on the deck of a carpet boat, laying them on the ground, that doesn't do well for the slime layer. It also risks losing scales. And so we really want to minimize that. And so how do you eliminate contact with dry surfaces? You hold fish with clean, bare, wet hands. There's been some controversy in the trout world about using tailing gloves. We won't even get into that. But, you know, sometimes even looking at the condition of the gloves that people use, it can rub off slime. If you do happen to use a net for any reason, there's been ample science that shows these rubberized nets are the best. They do the least for removing slime. They do the least for removing scales and also fang fins, not fraying fins. Sorry, that's a tongue twister. And then obviously grip the fish carefully. You don't want to squeeze or hug because, you know, there's some, you know, we've got internal organs in those fish that are usually suspended by the water. And the more that we squish or squeeze them, we don't know what's happening. You know, this one here, don't bring a fish into the boat, is kind of important, not because of the fear of dragging it, but if you're especially dealing with novice anglers, somebody that's holding a fish for the first time, if that fish wiggles and they drop it, where are they going to drop it? They're going to drop it on a hard surface. They're going to drop it on the bottom of the boat. So this is why that if you've got somebody that's just caught a bass, they want to take a photo, if you can even lean over the side of the boat with that bass, even if they drop it, it drops into the water and doesn't get dropped on the side inside the boat where there can be loss of slime and even some physical injuries that can happen. You know, so we need to, that's that way that we can treat these fish with care. And again, don't rest them on the sand or rocks or their shoreline.
Andy, I got a quick question, because for our club, we have this cool big bass contest and we use a measuring, and I mean, I don't see how we could do it otherwise and be like fair and honest. Like that's one of the great things in the club, big bass fun, seeing those fish and seeing them.
So here's a question. Could you adapt? So the one thing, and I'll show it to you in another image coming up, you sort of just see it out of the corner of the eye, but one thing we could work on is actually creating like a water-filled trough that has a tape on it. Or there are ways that you can do it where you can measure the fish and keep the fish in the water. Or if you can handle the fish really well and you have somebody else in the boat that can tape it for you, then as long as you're keeping it off of a hard surface, then it's probably going to be better than not. So
what we're doing now, Andy, is we are putting them on what we call a check-it stick or similar. You're probably familiar with that. But we ask our members to wet that check-it stick prior to measuring it. It maybe not ideal, but I think it does help because it keeps the fish wet, and you wet the check-it stick before.
Yep, and I think that would work. I also think that making sure the check-it stick's hasn't been sitting in the sun, and it's not hot. We've just done a study on the other end for ice fishing that shows that the surface temperature of the fish does not reflect the surface temperature of the water. In cold conditions, this fish can get wind chill, they can get frostbite pretty bad. And I think the same is true that if you have a fish out of the water for an extended period of time, and hopefully if you can measure it quickly, that's great. But you know, if you're putting it on the check-it stick and it's hot, you got to think that that's a problem for the fish, right? So you know, I think when we look at these combinations of best practices, you know, what we're trying to do is and we can provide some guidance about how you can adapt things to make it better for the fish and still achieve what your goals are. And so, but that's you know, and we understand that there's certain realities that things may not work in particular situations, and that not all fishing events are created equal. It's the same thing that happens in the Pacific Northwest with steelhead. And you know, some people say that on a sharp bank of a river, you know, it's really hard to get to basically handle a fish in such a way where you're not going to be taking it out of the water or using a net, because there's the risk of falling in the water and not being safe for the angler. So there's we certainly understand that there are limitations to some of these best practices, for sure. And I think that this is where I get excited, because as a scientist, I also, when I hear these types of things, I'm like, that's awesome. And it's great that you want to measure the fish, but you know, how can we work to make it better, so that it's better for the bass and you can still achieve what you want to do with it as a club. And then the third main principle is reducing handling time. And handling time is from the time that you land the fish to the time that you release it. And we have to remember that we're dealing with wild animals, right? We're restraining, whether it's in your net, in your hand, or I know some fisheries, they use a cradle. That it includes everything from the time that you land it, dehook it, take a photo, measure it, whatever. And there have been some evidence showing that, so once that fish is landed, it's no longer exercising, right? So it's no longer building up the blood lactate. It's no longer using its muscles, but it's still restrained. It's still stressed. And so the more that you can do to reduce the time that you handle it, the better. And so, and something just crossed my mind. I typed in the word cradle in here for a second, and a cradle might be an interesting option for measuring bass. So we can maybe talk about that offline at some point, where you keep the fish in the water and you can still get good tape measure on it. So I've seen them used in other fisheries. And so how do you reduce handling time? Going barbless is pretty important, especially when you start to get deep hooked fish. The faster you can get that hook out, the better. And there's been ample studies showing that barbless hooks don't actually decrease your catch rate. And so when you think about it, you know, a simple act of cripping a barb doesn't cost any money, but it might allow that fish to, you might reduce physical injury and also get that fish on its way and allow it to grow. A reminder here, I got this nice soft plastic here, in terms of handling time. Also, in terms of the environment, we want to make sure that if any of these plastics are left around, that we hopefully grab them and put them back and take them to the trash. You know, having this plastic in the environment is not good. So I made sure to put that image in here just to remind us. You know, carrying a hook removal device, you know, if you've got a big bass like this and you can turn the hook, great. But if you need a pair of pliers or another hook removing tool, you know, that helps. The reminder here, if it's deeply hooked, like this bass in the lower right, it's best to cut the line. Trying to dig that thing out is not so good, because that point of that hook is probably close to the heart. There's a lot of questions I get asked about, you know, how long do you revive a fish for? If that fish is seems like it's ready to go, let it go. There's no benefit of holding a fish longer because you think you're going to do more benefit, because what happens is the stress of the event is still kind of going through the fish's body, and the sooner that you let it go, the better. So if it's got kick, if it can stay upright, you know, let it go. Holding it for too much longer is not going to do it. If you start to let it go and it starts to list on its side, if you can grab it again and then recover it, that's when it needs that help. But I've seen, yes, sir.
Let me ask a question. Cutting the line is something that near and dear to a lot of our members' hearts, but we had a question posed. What do you do about a treble hook? Let's say a crankbait and the fish has swallowed a crankbait. Doesn't happen often, but does happen. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, in those rare events, still I've seen treble hooks. Well, if it's on a crankbait and you got to get that whole crankbait out,
Yeah,
leaving that whole crankbait in, I would say you could still try to get it out, knowing that you're probably going to potentially risk the life of that fish. I would say if it's of harvestable size, then you might want to take that one home. Because the likelihood of trying to because ultimately you're going to, work really hard to restrain that fish. You're going to take the treble hook out. And so I'm sorry, I don't have the chat open here, so I couldn't see it. And so, I think that's a tricky situation where you have to decide on what happens to the fate of that fish and if you have options. We have done a study actually with northern pike where we've left lures on the side of fish's heads where it wasn't deeply hooked. And it's amazing. We're able to put transmitters on the lure and transmitters on the fish. And over time, we were able to show that the actual transmitters, the lures will fall off. I think it's different if it's deeply hooked. And I think in that situation, you just have to make the decision that, you'll do your best with that fish. And, if it starts to bleed and it doesn't look like it's going to make it, and if it's of harvestable size and you're allowed to do it, it might be better to take that fish.
and Andy, we have about 10 minutes and I wanted to give members a chance for Q&A. So if we can leave just a few minutes at the end.
I'm almost done.
Okay.
So speaking about bleeding, really quickly, do not pour carbonated beverages on your bass's gills or pike or anything else. This went through social media really quickly. It's viral that if you put Coke or Mountain Dew on your fish's gills, if it's bleeding, it stops them from bleeding. I won't get into the science, but what we did is we replicated this. We used different carbonated beverages. And what happens is it gives you the perception that the blood stops. It stops for a very short period of time. And of course, that's what the angler sees. But then after the fish swims away, the blood just starts pumping out. And it's not good for the fish. So really quickly, if your fish looks like the one above and it's bleeding like crazy, don't worry about pouring Coke or Mountain Dew. And I think if it's bleeding out, then either harvest it or, hopefully it's gonna, if thinking about the sublethal effects, when you let it go, it might be one that just the likelihood it might not make it. The last thing is fish-friendly photos, is being prepared. And so, make sure the camera is ready to go. 1, 2, 3, lift the fish, click, be mindful of conditions. And I have to put a plug in that the little young man on the right is my son about 3 years ago with his first largemouth bass in Ontario. And in the foreground, you can see this blue padded trough. We actually fished in a boat with a friend that has this trough you can actually see the ruler in the bottom, and he filled it with water. The fish came in from the boat or from the water, went into the trough, measured it, and took a picture and let it go. And so it's basically thinking about these techniques to allow that fish to not be out of the water for very long, and just being mindful of having the forethought to plan ahead to what you're going to do. And so what can you do? This is the plug for Keep Fish Wet. Using the best practices and become an advocate. So there's a link to Keep Fish Wet and becoming an advocate. So all this information is on the website. And if you sign up to become an advocate, where it's not a member-based organization, because we think membership provides barriers to inclusion. We want everybody to share this stuff. And then, because as a not-for-profit, we always make a plug for making donations, because every drop counts. And what I'm going to do is then just leave it there. I know it was in the mailer about the website. And then I'm just going to leave a picture for some black bass up there, and we can stop sharing and open it up for questions.
Great. Well, thank you. That was very interesting. I know I get questions all the time, especially about, what do I do when the fish swallows the hook? So you answered that I've seen the same stuff about pouring Coke on the gill, so that was interesting. And I know some of this is ideal, what we do ideally, and some of it is how we actually practice it. And sometimes they go together. Sometimes it's tough just to keep a fish out for 10 seconds. But I would be curious, is there any research to say that at 1 minute, or let's say you keep that, it takes you 30 seconds to get it unhooked, and then you want to take a picture, and at a certain point, is there a certain period of time that it's almost for sure that that fish will not make it? Do we know any of that research?
So there has been a lot of research that's looked at the mortality of black bass, largemouth bass after catch and release, and they're actually relatively robust to air exposure. And so the where we see the effects occur are more on the sublethal effects. So I'm not sure if you allow fishing when bass are spawning, for instance, but if you happen to catch a fish off of its nest and you take it out of the water for 10 seconds and you reduce the time, what often happens is egg predators come in and they gobble up all the eggs, and then that parent doesn't have any babies to contribute to the next generation. And there actually has been some evidence showing that prolonged air exposure reduces swimming performance. So what that means, if your swimming performance or if your running performance is reduced because you haven't recovered from that exercise, then you're not going to be able to swim and attack bait or prey the same way. So mortality for black bass, most of it is hooking damage. That's where we need to be particularly important. But I think where it comes to air exposure is the more that we can limit it, the better. I would still go for 10 seconds, but I think 30 seconds is probably okay. I think there have been studies that kept black bass out for longer than that. And it showed that it didn't result in any mortality, but there was cascading effects on downstream in terms of its ability to go back and do its thing. So I would just, I see a question from Steven. Is there a situation when holding a fish in the live well for a period of time might be more beneficial than the immediate release? Yeah, so it really depends on live well conditions. So it's still a lot, there's been a lot of studies done on largemouth bass and live wells. Live wells will add a little bit of stress, but if you put it in a live well and it gives you enough time to get organized to take that photo, then it's worth it. Obviously not leaving a bass in a live well for half an hour when you don't have the water running or the water's temperature is high. There's been a lot of science that's looked at the conditions in live wells, especially if you're running a boat and the fish is bouncing around like a lot of tournament anglers. So a live well is it's similar to the water-filled trough or a cooler. Anything you can do to keep the fish submerged while you're getting organized is better than nothing. And so in terms of the ranking of sort of these best practices across all of the studies that have been done on catch and release, the major thing that results in mortality is hook damage. And so, if you can get hook damage under control, and if you have a deeply, hooked fish, cutting the line is great. If you're not digging it out, that's awesome. Using barbless hooks helps. But the next thing in terms of stressors is air exposure, right? So it goes, hooking damage, air exposure, and then lots of the other things like dragging them on the gunnel and all that other stuff. So if we can get hooking times and dehooking better, and we can minimize air exposure, then the best. So I see another one by Interlocking Partner. Sorry, I don't know who you are. But if the water's hot and low in oxygen, can you put the fish in a live well with aeration for say 20 minutes? Is that a good idea? I would say it wouldn't hurt. And it depends if you're talking about bubbling, or I know there's a lot of companies out there, or there have been in the past, where you're injecting pure oxygen. That doesn't work at all. We've done some studies to look at, there's like something called oxygen anywhere, that too much oxygen actually stops the recovery from happening. And so live well conditions is a very delicate formula. I think if water temperatures are hot and you can keep the fish to let it sort of recover a tiny bit until you've got, if you're ready to take your photo, then I would say let it go. The longer you hold it, remember that's still retention, that's still stressful. So it's finding that sweet spot. And so if it's, you know, again, hooking damage, air exposure, and then everything else will be helpful from then on out.
I think part of the question is also water temperature, guys. So we haul fish and we see a tremendous difference when we move bait fish when we're hauling in cool water versus warm water. And what is cool water versus warm water? For us, there's a delineation at about 75, 78 degrees. The fish really stress a lot harder than when it's below 75, 78. And that's not a hard and fast number. That's just kind of been my experience. Mortality goes up a lot when that water temperature goes warm. So for instance, San Saba, Waco Creek Ranch is one of our properties. The landowner will often close the lake in the extreme heat because of the damage that he's afraid will occur on some of his larger fish. You have to remember those large 10, 11, 12 pound fish, they're old fish. You know, they're not youngsters. And so you can really stress those fish. So water temperature plays a huge role in how you handle your fish.
Yeah, and I took that slide out. I had a slide. Temperature is the master factor in fish. It controls everything. It controls their metabolism. It controls how they deal with stress. It controls, because at higher water temperatures, dissolved oxygen is actually lower, right? Yeah. So it controls everything. It influences it all. And so we have to be especially careful at high water temperatures. I see a question from Chris Cassidy about holding a bass by the mouth versus the body. And I think if you're going to take it out of the water, having that extra hand under the sort of the belly provides that extra support for the vertebrae. If you're holding it upside down or vertically, that puts a lot of strain on the vertebrae. And so preferably if you're able to suspend the fish, hopefully over the water or over a trough, it's going to be best for the internal organs. And it's also going to be a lot easier to get that fish back in the water. Using clamps to weigh largemouth bass. Does it matter what part of the mount the clamp? Yeah. So I would say, you know, either the top or right in the middle is best because there's not a lot of vasculature. You know, I realize that weighing is pretty important for bass anglers in addition to length. I would be careful about the types of tools that you use. We've done some studies with boga grips where they have the two metal tines that come together, and we've shown that it can actually rip the tissues. So I'd be interested in thinking about which kind of clamps or what kind of things you're using for weighing bass, or if you could. This comes the idea of cradles. I might share some ideas with you afterwards about some ways you can actually measure and weigh fish in an effective way where you're not extending air exposure. So,
and Riverhorse, you gave the example of landing a fish and running a sprint. Can you give that? That was a great visual for me.
Well, I mean, I had never thought about it till Andy did a talk with us on one of our Patagonia team meetings, the fish team, and he said, "You've got that fish. In a sense, it's like you ran down the block." And you're out of air and somebody grabbed you and stopped you from breathing, maybe put a bag over your head or something. And when you think of it that way, I mean, those fish are so out when you get them in there, depending on how quick you caught it. And, you know, with fly fishing, it takes us probably a little longer sometimes to get that big bass in. And some of you guys have some more stout fishing rods and you take care of business really quick. So it's all relative, but if that fish is really worn out and then they're out of the water, it just makes sense. They're going to need that oxygen. So yeah, even every time I hear Andy talk, I just feel bad. I'm like, man, I got those fish.
But we've all done it, right? And we all do it. And it's like, and it's incremental, you know, and this is where I grew up fishing and I still have been excited. I've been fishing and be excited, and you want to get that picture. It's why we don't say like, don't take the fish out of the water at all. We don't say that at all, because that also takes away from the pleasure of going fishing. But we also say, let's use the science to inform how we handle these fish so that we do have those fish grow to be trophies faster. There's less that you have to invest in the management of the fishery, right? Those fish are wonderful wild beasts. They're we've invested in management of them, and so for that little extra moment of thinking about how you're going to handle it before you land it, and working together if you're with somebody, or thinking about how you're going to dehook it, that's a little bit that we can offer to these fish for the enjoyment that they provide us, right? So I think that's where I've done enough, had enough chats with people who aren't anglers that ask about is this torturing fish and stuff, and like, no, because we're trying to minimize, looking about the investment, think about the value that fishing has to everything we do. That I think that if we can minimize the stresses, then it just makes the future of what we do even better. Going back to these broader things in conservation, and also if we're taking care of like the fish that we handle, then those other things that are influencing fish populations, like if we get into a heavy drought, right, and all of a sudden water levels are impacted, and and nutrient levels are changing, we can't control them fast enough with augmentation. If their fish are stressed because of other things, then it's more important we can take care of what we can by handling them better. They're going to be more resilient to the other stressors that they're experiencing. So we have to think about it more collectively that way.
Well, plus the important joy of sending an 8-10 pound bass photo to your buddies while they're at work.
Hey, before we go, I want to make sure that I didn't introduce both Cole and Scott. And for those of you who have not met Scott and Cole, you guys say hello. Can you see everybody?
Hey guys.
These are the guys that you talked to on the phone. And Scott's new, started in August, and actually is a partner with the company. And for a lot of practical purposes, he's kind of running the show. So, and then Cole, who's a rock star, the guys that you speak to most all the time, is we couldn't live without Cole, and keeps everything going here at Private Water Fishing. So I just wanted to make sure I introduce these guys to you properly.
Yep.
So Andy, we thank you so much. For those of you who enjoyed the presentation, which I think is everybody, because I think we had one person bail out of 34 who joined us, which is incredible. If you enjoyed the presentation today, it's keepfishwet.org, right? Am I right on that?
Yep.
And you can make a donation. They live by donations. We want to support them. We want to thank them for their time, or Andy specifically, and I want to thank Riverhorse, awesome member. By the way, I need to plug him. If you have not read his fishing report on Lakota, Cleveland, Lakota Lake, and or Grapeland, Bennett Lake about 6, 7, 8 years ago, you do yourself a favor. It reads like a Field and Stream article. He's obviously a gifted writer. That's what he does. He enjoys Shinerbach, apple fritters, and I kind of almost have the story memorized. He does a great visual of painting the picture. So in conclusion, is there anything that you want to say, Andy or Riverhorse?
Sorry. Go ahead, River.
Like, and Andy knows this, I've gotten to go all over the world, around the world fishing. And I just wanted to thank you guys, Steve, because this is my home, Texas. And those days I've had alone on those ranches, or with best friends, or taking my dad to those are some of the greatest memories ever. My girlfriend and I have had so many, just awesome times. The club, those ranches, those moments, those days mean everything to me. So thanks for all the stuff you're doing and having us. It seems unbelievable when I get out there. I can't believe we get to have those days out there.
Well, thank you. It's our pleasure doing it. I mean that sincerely. It's great fun and I know it sounds canned, but it's true. We love it, and we have such a great membership. But it's 1 in a million where we have an issue. Everybody is, it just works. So it's a good group of folks. Andy, anything in conclusion?
just the last thing. So, continue to use me as a resource, right? You guys have my contact information, like shoot me an email if you have questions that come up. If there are opportunities to help improve what you do in terms of handling, like I'm happy to think through things. I'm also done a lot with water quality and everything else, but I'm happy to again, sort of help with the future of the club, and hopefully one day I can come down and fish with you all. So,
All right, love it.
Perfect.
All right, guys, thanks for participating. Bye-bye.
take care, everybody.
Yeah, thanks. And at the bottom right. And